All right. To everybody that joined, thank you. We're hoping to have an exciting and interesting conversation with Dr. Harini. As all of you know, MP for the JBB, JJB, sorry, beg your pardon. Dr. Harini, we're going to start with the topic that is on everybody's minds at the moment, or the most topical topic, so to speak, which is COVID-19. And the first question I had for you was in relation to COVID-19 management on a national level. We have a Minister of Health who's a woman. We have a minister for the specific task of managing COVID-19 who is also a woman. And yet we have a task force that is headed by a military chief that sort of supersedes them all. Even without making this necessarily a gender issue, do you think that this sort of structure is practical or rational? And if, how would you restructure it if you were given the chance?
I think our experience of COVID itself is telling us that this existing structure is not working. So definitely there is a need to restructure. I think what has happened is that there's a real lack of clarity as to who's making decisions and how these decisions are communicated and who's really in charge. So the Ministry of Health actually has a system, has a structure that was in place previously when we had to deal with any kind of infectious disease issue. There is a established department managing disease control and epidemics actually, and that has not really been activated. We also have a disaster management authority or a council at the national level, again, which has not been activated. So, as a result, the sort of existing structure has been undermined and new structures have been put in place, like the COVID management task force, which I think is not really integrated with the system that has to implement the decisions. So there is a discrepancy between where decisions are made, how decisions are made, and how they are implemented. So this is, I think, the reason for the confusion. And if I think if we were to restructure, we would simply make the Ministry of Health take the lead in all of this. The political authority really does have a significant role here in terms of the day-to-day management of COVID. Rather, what needs to happen is that the system in place has to be ensured that the people who are actually making the decisions and who know the experts have to be supported to do their job, right? So we would give the Ministry of Health the overall leadership in this, the technical experts, and ensure that they have the resources to do their job. That's the role of the political authority.
Right, and the argument that the military is being used for administrative purposes. I mean, Sri Lanka's health system itself is very devolved. So, would you agree that that's not necessary?
Sorry, Royal, can you say that a bit louder? I just lost you for a minute.
Yeah, for sure. So basically, the argument that the military is being used for either administration or enforcement, it doesn't really hold water, given the fact that the ministry of or the health system in Sri Lanka is very devolved.
Yeah.
So it can be used even it can be used right across Sri Lanka, and you
Yeah.
don't necessarily need military. I think especially if you saw the pictures from Iravur yesterday.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know if you missed it.
No, I did see that.
This
Yeah.
could be right. So this could be. Sorry, you guys missed me for a second. This could be the fallout of having military administration as opposed to empowered health system.
Yeah.
Doctor, I know
Yeah.
that. I mean, you're. Go ahead.
No, that's what I wanted to say. In that, actually, we have a health system that goes right down to the community. Especially with regard to our public health system, we have a really good community health system in place through the MOH, right? We have a public health midwife, we have a PHI, we have a MOH that reaches almost every household, can potentially reach every household. We have a Grama Sevak Niladari who's also very intimately connected to each household in the community. So that is the system that needed to be really strengthened and pushed to respond to this. The
Right.
military or the security forces do have a role, but that role has to be clearly defined. And actually, at this point, in terms of management of disease and management of the spread of the disease and dealing with the health and social consequences, really is not the role of the military. And as you said, what happened in Eravur is not just. I mean, it's completely unacceptable, right? It's completely unacceptable at so many levels because that's just not how you treat people. I mean, that's just not how you deal with people who even break the law. That's
Right.
just completely unacceptable.
Right. Doctor, I also wanted to ask you, since you were an educator for a while, at least part of the debate around COVID-19 has also been about the children in the school systems, and this is a topic I know that educators have been really pushing for and trying to get some reform in relation to, and that is about children sitting for their O level and A level exams, and how. So there's a how do I put this? There's a split in the debate on how to deal with this, and it seems like the government and authorities are of the view that giving fiber networks to schools or setting up e-centers with computers so that rural children can attend in some setting these schools in schools will help with education. But there are educators who say this doesn't balance that divide, that digital divide, and there are children who don't have devices, and this sort of thing cannot be spread across the entire country. And I mean, there is some semblance of, I mean, what they're saying is true. And they feel that basically what needs to be done is that the education system needs to be abridged at the moment, temporarily at least, during this period of COVID-19, where instead of 8 subjects, children are allowed to do just the core subjects: mathematics, language of preference, maybe English, that sort of thing. As an educator, what do you think? And is that something that you can bring to Parliament?
Um, okay, so with the issue of education, I think first of all we have to recognize that we are living in extremely abnormal circumstances. These kinds of pandemics happen maybe once every 500 years or so, right? The last time this happened was with the Spanish flu. So in those sort of situations, we can't sort of carry on as if normal. I'm really wary of this idea of the new normal, as if we have to somehow adjust and carry on in these circumstances without acknowledging the huge disruption that that COVID has brought on our lives, right? So
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to even the education sector, I think first of all, the education system has to acknowledge the disruption and accommodate that disruption.
Yeah.
Accommodating that disruption means, sorry, I don't know whether you can hear
No,
my
no.
neighbor's dogs barking. I have 6 dogs in the next household, and every time something goes past, especially the Pang man, they get very
we can
excited.
we, yeah, we can hear them, but I also think once the chode man passes, they'll calm down as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
But we
Once
can
the
hear
tune
you in
man
general.
passes, they will calm down. But while the tune man is in the vicinity, they are very noisy. Sorry. So
Yeah.
as I was saying, they have to acknowledge the disruption and not ignore that disruption. So in one sense, yes, we have to take the syllabus into account. But I think it is crazy to imagine that we can sort of carry on as normal and just have exams as scheduled, and just sort of, offer online education, which, as we know, is not equitable at all because we are dealing with a very inequitable digital infrastructure situation, and just sort of carry on, right? So yes, I think the syllabus has to be adjusted. Examination system has to be adjusted. We have to recognize that we are in a pandemic situation, and we have to take into account that and plan and adjust our education system accordingly. I think this would also be an opportunity. I don't know, and I have no, I don't think this has happened. For instance, some part of the education process right now has to be about teaching young people how to deal with COVID, right? We
Yeah.
have, there are, the kids are stuck at home. There are all kinds of changes to our lives, and I think there needs to be some way in which the education system acknowledges that and has some amount of their some intervention into helping children to cope with that situation. I think the same goes for the university sector. This is a time perhaps that faculty and even students should be encouraged to read about COVID, do research into COVID, think of ways in which they can intervene in the COVID management situation. This is also part of learning, right? This is also part of education, to respond to what is happening around you and not to sort of pretend that, so sort of not just ignore that and carry on as normal, right? So that requires the syllabus to be reviewed in the context of COVID and adjusted accordingly.
Right. And is this something that you can personally do something about? Just curious.
Well, I can
No
raise,
pressure.
we can raise these issues, right? But I
Yeah.
think we are I am one of three in my party in parliament, right? Uh, even we can keep raising these issues, but at the end of the day, we don't have the power to implement these things, right?
Yes.
That has to come from the government. What we can certainly do is also mobilize people to bring pressure on the government to adjust, to listen, and to certainly work with the community, work with the public on raising these issues. But the end of the day, implementation lies with the power to implement things lies with the government. And I mean, we have been doing this. We have been talking constantly about the problems in education and trying to raise these things. But I'm not sure the government is listening.
Okay, Doctor. I also want to move to thanks for that very detailed and useful answer, and I really hope you are able to raise it even more in Parliament. But I want to also move to this month. It's Pride Month.
Yes.
And yeah, the JJB and the JVP are probably the only parties in the history of Sri Lanka to support that community. So I'm going to start with asking a very brief, sort of broad question: why?
Well, our political ideology is about social justice and equality, right? It is about working on those issues, and I think what brought us to this position was the recognition that yes, we are politically, we are a left wing party which traditionally only sort of saw class as the big divider, right? But I think when you apply socialist ideology to current situations, and I think that's the discussion we are having in our movement right now, is that along with class, there are lots of other issues also around which people have mobilized, and also around which people experience injustice and experience marginalization. So, as a party that is for whom equality and social justice is sort of central to their political political ideology, then it is absolutely essential that we take on issues of people who are discriminated, groups that are marginalized, and groups that are excluded. So it was not a, it was sort of a very logical step for us to take. If we are talking about, when we talk about gender, when we talk about women's rights, when we talk about minority rights or whatever, then LGBTQI community is also a community that we need to address. And we worked with groups who identified themselves as LGBTQI. They contributed to some of our policy development processes. So it was a very logical step for us to take that position.
Okay, thank you. But, as a follow-up question, Doctor, the reason why other parties don't or won't represent the LGBTQIA community is because, I mean, it's very simple. They're afraid of losing the support of their majority voter base, which is largely the Sinhala Buddhist voter. What is it that prevents the JB or the JVP from being fearful of that? Because you all have the same concerns, right?
Yes, we
Or
do.
would have the same
We
concerns,
do
yeah.
have the same concerns, and I think many of the positions we take are not popular with the voters. Otherwise, we wouldn't be only three in parliament, right? So, but yet we have to, this is not, for us, it is not just about doing anything to get into power. It is also
Right.
about doing what is right. It's also about being true to our political positions, right? And so if we are that doesn't mean that we are not interested in power. I mean, obviously, as a political party, the ultimate goal is for us to gain power.
Be,
But
correct.
if people are not ready to come on board with us, then we have to keep raising these issues till people are ready, right? It doesn't mean then that we ignore the issue because it's not popular right now, right? Of course, the intensity with which we take on the issue, we may have to be strategic, right? But it doesn't mean that we forget that issue. We can't, right? Because if we claim to be an alternative discourse, if we claim to be different from the others, that has to be also evident in our political practice, not just
Right.
in our theory.
And yeah, and my next few questions also tie up into this larger picture of why the the two bigger parties get a steer clear of representing the LGBTQIA community, and why the JJB and the JVP have continued to, I mean, at least in the recent past, stand for them or represent them. Another one is going deeper into the issue in terms of ethnic composition. Of course, these parties are mostly alike. And when I say these parties, I'm talking about SJB or UNP, the SLFP, and the SLPP. And even the JJB slash JVP, these are in terms of ethnic composition mostly alike. But where there is a difference is with political ideology, like you just said. And also things like, which you mentioned, class and caste, which has historically played a role in Sri Lankan politics. Do you think it's because the JJB and the JVP do not ascribe value to things like caste and class, that they are able to represent underrepresented communities like this, because it's not at the expense of communities that are vulnerable, that you're trying to get power?
Well, if you look at the origins of one of the main political party in the alliance, the JVP, it developed very much in response to the sort of class and caste politics in this country, right? It was an anti-establishment movement. So for many of us who are associated with the JJB, the Jatika Jana Balabegya, we are in it because we have a critique of the existing system. We have a critique of the existing forms of exclusion and division and marginalization, right? That is very, very central to our politics. So the sort of class analysis of of the Sri Lankan political context is very central to the positions we take. Then certainly in Sri and we recognize that it's and that's a recognition that we are discussing more and more is the intersectionality of all of these different identities, right? So then it's not that we discount any of those, we recognize how how identities and how sort of social economic kind of factors have positioned us in society, and how that is a central factor in the inequality that exists in our in society, right? That's very much that analysis is extremely important to the kinds of positions we take, right? But I think when it comes to sort of ethnic representation, many of the partners of the JJB, our constituencies have been in what is known as the South, right? Our relationships with the North and East are developing, but are not as strong as in the South. So I think that's the reason why we are not as well represented when it comes to ethnic issues, or why our presence is not strong enough in the North and East, right? And I think so sort of historically this has been a factor, and this is something that we are working on, right? So when we take into account what our political positions are, all those different factors are very much a part of our analysis. But in terms of our strength and our focus on how much each of these issues play a role, it's also kind of dependent on the structures we have at the ground level to really speak on or act on those issues, right? And I think when
Right.
it comes to the ethnic representation, we need to do much better.
Right. Doctor, I am now going to pause to open it up for questions. I think I've briefed you on how this works.
Yeah.
The people in the audience in the Twitter spaces, in our spaces, can request by hitting the mic button on the left if you have any questions. We would like to remind you that while there are no restrictions to what you can ask the doctor, since there's no specificity to this topic, it is completely incumbent on the doctor to decide if she wants to take it or not. So, Dr. Harini, you have the right to decline a question if you want to.
Okay.
Let's just see if there are any takers. We have Kishan as a speaker. We would also like to remind our audiences that we reserve the right to moderate and also to close for questions if we feel so fit. Having said that, Kishan, you can ask your question of Dr. Harini.
Uh, Doctor, good morning, and nice to
Good
hear
morning.
you. And it's actually refreshing to see politicians like you, or academics like you coming into politics. But my question is now, there is a lot of things to admire about JVP politicians, even the people who are professional politicians, from a perspective of personal integrity and things like that. But my question is the JVP in its policies, especially for example, if you take education, it was has been instrumental and in coming against, for example, the private medical colleges, private university systems, and things like that. Whereas countries all over the world, including communist countries like China, have some sort of even in the higher education, private education. So my question is, how is the JVP looking at changing its sometimes dinosaur like policies, which were maybe relevant in the 50s, to the modern times where the whole dynamics have changed?
Thank you, Kishan, for your question. I think that's a really important one, and I'm really glad to get an opportunity to address this on the Twitter space, because I think that's probably quite a space where this is discussed quite a lot. Actually, and I'm not answering on behalf of the JVP. I'm responding to that question as part of the JJB, the Jatika Janabala Vegya, of which the JVP is a part, right? Um, for us, education, there are uh, certain sectors that we believe need to be publicly owned and publicly managed, that are accessible to all on an equitable basis. And we think things like health, education, transport, and social security needs to be mediated, need to be recognized as public goods, right? So when we say public goods, that means that those sectors cannot be run on the basis of profit. It cannot be regulated by the logic of market. It has to be regulated on a broader principle of what it means to be a public good. So, in that sense, that is the point at which we have always stood for the public, for the public education system rather than for a privatized education system, because on the again on the principle of that things that are absolutely essential for human well-being cannot be regulated by the profit motive or by market logic, right? Now, in this country, in Sri Lanka, we have had a history, we have a very strong sort of historical commitment to the free health and the public health and public education system. And we think that that has sort of, in a way, if you think of sort of institutions or policies that have really shaped post-independent Sri Lankan life, the public health and the public education system are central to that. And we think there's a huge value in protecting those, because that is what enabled the vast majority of people in this country, um, whatever their economic position, to access these as public goods, right? Whatever can be, and that doesn't mean that those sectors don't require reform, that those sectors don't require change. Certainly they do. But we stand by the position that there are certain things which are essential for people's basic survival and basic well-being, which should be considered as public goods and not managed on market or the logic of the market, or on the basis of on the motive for profit making. And I actually disagree with you a little bit when you said that these are ideas that are sort of the dinosaur age. I think there's a huge move right now in many parts of the country to move away from privatized education to making education free. I mean, this is the whole sort of campaign on which people like Bernie Sanders and others in the US, or the Labour Party in the UK, or even in places like New Zealand, where there's been a big move to to sort of return to the idea of free education and sort of free tuition and education as a public good, because for many years they too have now experienced how sort of a privatized education system can lead to real inequalities in society.
Kishan, does that answer your question?
No. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you, Doctor. I think that is where there is an ideological difference, I think. But may I just, with all due respect to your academic achievements and also intellectual integrity, may I suggest to you that education and healthcare is not a public good according to the definition of economics. It is a merit good. And merit goods are goods which can be provided by both the government and the private sector. And I grant fully what you said, that everyone has a right to free education. But the critical difference, I think I asked you, and I think this is where the JVP or JJB or whatever your configuration is, refuses to clearly answer, is while providing everyone with a guaranteed free education, why is it that you all oppose competing private education? No one is, and to talk about Bernie Sanders and all that is also slightly disingenuous as a public good, because in America they are not talking about the state providing all the education free. They are talking about financing the education of children through various means. That could be the state or the private sector. So this is the critical difference I am talking. I am not talking about doing away with private. I am asking very clearly, what is your policy on whether you all are willing to accommodate the competing private sector? So if I want to send my son to a private university in Sri Lanka while paying for it, I should have the every right to do so. In the same way as a poor child who cannot afford it has every right to enter a state university and get it free. That is my question.
Mm,
Okay,
Okay,
now I'm going to
yeah.
jump in
Mm.
before anything else and say, Dr. Harini, if you want to make if you want to take this ideological debate, because this has become a very nuanced debate elsewhere on Twitter, you can answer through DMs or you can answer through Twitter. Twitter just tweets that are sent out. We can show you how. You don't have to answer the question now because it may devolve into an entire different debate that we don't want to take elsewhere. So you have the right to say we can discuss this later, Kishan, and talk to him later.
Okay, I can do that, but let me just answer very briefly. I think this is, we need to understand clearly what I said was that we do not think those public goods should be managed under the logic of the market or for profit motives. With and I think that's different. That's an economic argument in and of itself is not sufficient to really understand what is essentially a social policy. There has to be a more holistic understanding of social policy, not just something that is based on an economic rationale. So let me stop with that, and Kishan, I'm happy to have this conversation with you later on if you require more clarification. It is an ideological debate, but I think it's an important ideological debate.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harini. Like I said, we can show you how to have the conversation on Twitter, and it's important, like you said, but perhaps not to that degree on this space. I think we have another speaker, Mariam.
Hi, Roel. Am I audible?
Hi, you are.
Hi, Dr. Amarasuriya.
Hi.
Thanks for joining the space and giving us the option to ask you questions. So my question actually has to do with what you were speaking about, public goods and services. Um, I want to know, in your experience with voters and with the public, how receptive do you think people are to this idea of public services? Do enough Sri Lankans understand the importance of this? I'm asking because, in the light of the general criticism that's directed at the public sector, accusations of people just taking perks and not really being as, as competitive or efficient. Um, how can you steer the conversation, I think, towards a more educational or, more convincing track? Is my question, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think this is a very broad debate that maybe we need to have, right? But when we say when we talk about the relevance of the public sector to people's lives, I think we need to also understand that for a vast majority of people in this country, they have no option but a public service, right? So when we talk about the efficiency and or the lack of efficiency or whatever it is, I think we are talking about that from a very privileged position, right? So for the vast majority of people in this country, the public sector is the only option. And that's one thing. And I think this, and secondly, I think over the past 30 odd years, there has been a willful and deliberate neglect of the public sector, of these public services, not the public sector, of these public services, which have led to tremendous issues in each of those sectors. Certainly in health, in education, in transport, there are severe problems. But that doesn't, and if you, but if you look at some of the issues that we are currently facing, even with regard to managing the COVID pandemic, I think there's one lesson that we should take from all of this is the fact that the existing system hasn't really succeeded in dealing with many of the issues that have that the pandemic has thrown at us, right? That in a way the market or only a market sort of driven logic will struggle to deal with the kinds of epidemics and the kinds of consequences of these epidemics that we are dealing with. And that the neglect of sectors such as health and education have actually caused us to face many of these problems. I mean, as has been the cause of many of the problems that we are currently dealing with. So, so for that reason, this is why I think this conversation is really important, and why we need to think about um, think about sort of how access and equitable access has to be one of the most sort of important or central concerns when we are thinking about policy and thinking about public services. So this is, I think, a really important conversation to be had, right? And I think we also have to acknowledge that over the last 20, 30 years, we have been sort of compelled to seek seek compelled to kind of what's the word I'm looking at? Compelled to think that competition and reliance on the market logic for providing these services is the only way, right? And I think we need to recognize that there can be other models and other models that work. And I'm not talking about models that existed in the 40s or the 50s or the 60s or even the 70s, but models that take into account the current situation and have and respond to the sort of huge levels of inequality that actually exist in this, not just in our society, but in societies all over the world, right? And I think unless we address that, we are going to continue to face the kinds of problems that we are talking about right now.
Mariam, does that answer your question?
Thanks, Dr. Amarasuriya. I think you're right, actually. It's a very broad debate, and I agree with you, especially with regard to, I recall what you said earlier in the conversation about our health sector and even our Grama Niladhari services and how well connected they are. There's a lot of positive uh, a lot of positive things about our public sector, public services even. So I hope that we can have these conversations in whatever platforms that are effective and helpful in the future. Thank
Sure.
you.
Thanks, Mariam. Dr. Harini, I think you'll agree with me, even though you're a late comer to Twitter Spaces. There's a lot of intellectual debate that goes on here that can be very useful to informing policy in the future. We don't have any more questions, Dr. Harini, so I'm just going to go back to our discussion. What I wanted to ask you next is basically so, for many years, the JVP and then the JJB came in at a solid third at elections. Given how fractured the opposition is right now, and what seems to be an indication of like growing unpopularity of the current government, do you think this is the moment at which the JVP/JJB should step up and present themselves as the strong opposition?
Um, I think we have yes, certainly we need to we we see ourselves as the opposition, right? We see that we have a significant role to play at this moment in time. I think one of the things that I think when you assess the effectiveness or the impact of the JJB, if I say it this way, I think people listen to us. People are interested in hearing what we have to say, but they don't necessarily vote for us, right? uh, I think the influence we have on public opinion is much more. It doesn't always translate into votes, and I think uh, that is because people don't necessarily see us as able to be in power, right? We are often seen as like the, how do you say, like a watchdog organization, right? So you vote for the other parties, but you also need to have us in power to kind of expose the corruption, to speak out against issues. So you don't vote for us. You want somebody else to vote for us because you think that we also should be there to kind of act as watchdogs. So we've been put into this kind of watchdog role, and I think that's
Right.
the perception that we need to change. That we are not here as watchdogs. We are not here to sort of protect democracy for you or to sort of expose corruption on behalf of other people, right? We are here because we think that we can run this country, because we think that we
Right.
have something to offer for this country that is different from the other parties, and that we have the capacity and the capacity to do this, and that we have the vision to do this, and we certainly have the leadership to do this. This is
Right.
what we need to convince people, right? That we are not
Right.
here as watchdogs.
Right, Doctor. I also asked this of Vijita Herat, the propaganda secretary of the
Yeah,
JVP, some time ago,
yeah.
which is basically what he thought was lacking in terms of mass appeal. Now, I do know that some of the socialist policies, some of the some of these things may be seen as off-putting to, affluent, upward mobility-looking young people. Those may be some contributing factors. But besides that, and also the fact that the party as a whole seems to want to plug away at doing the right thing rather than jumping to do what you all perceive as the wrong thing for the wrong reasons. But besides that, in a larger scheme of things, what do you think is lacking? Is it a communication problem? Is it again, another question I asked him is, a lot of young people seem to affiliate themselves or find some kind of resonance with the JVP and parties like that. But then as they get older, they understand that maybe the world works differently, or they just take the easy way out and opt for a capitalist sort of society and market. Like, where do you think these things need to be stemmed, so to speak?
See, I think again there are many reasons. There's no one single reason, right? Certainly,
Correct.
I think over the last 2 to 3 decades, left-wing parties such as ours have taken a hammering, right? Since the 80s, there's been sort of a one ideological model that has dominated the world, the neoliberal, sort of capitalist neoliberal version, right? And
Yeah.
that's not necessarily because that's the best model, but because that became the dominant model for various reasons, right? With the fall of the Soviet Union, all of these factors, right? However, I think currently we see a sort of a resurgence of interest in alternative models, and that's coming about as a result of the result of the sort of increasing inequalities, issues of sort of, I think, climate change is going to drive us, whether we like it or not, to think of different ways of doing things, right? I think even the COVID pandemic, all of these factors is in a way demonstrating the limitations of a neoliberal capitalist model, right? We are searching for answers, right? We are searching for alternatives. But people, especially in Sri Lanka, and I think for that, the left wing parties in Sri Lanka have to take responsibility for that, have a very sort of um, kind of to use the words of Kishan, idea of socialism as something for the dinosaur age, right? Because when you think of socialism, you think of the Soviet Union. You think of Cuba. You know those are the sort of models that People have. But socialism also is an ideological, it's also an analytical tool for understanding society, right? And one of the principles is that is also a very dynamic model, right? It has to change, it has to adjust to context. So a socialist model today is going to be very different to what a socialist model looked like in the 80s or the 90s. A socialist model in Sri Lanka is very different to what a socialist model will be in China, is in Vietnam or any other part of the world, or in Cuba or any other part of the world, right? So I think rather than looking at us through those labels, I would encourage you to listen to the kinds of things we are saying, to listen to the kind of policy alternatives that we are offering, and then make a choice. And then think
Right.
about us, then make that judgment, right?
Right.
Rather than sort of, and thirdly, finally, I'll just say this and I'll end it. And I honestly do think that we have sort of reached a level of crisis within this capitalist model, which is going to force us to look for other answers. And I think the environmental issues is going to force us to do that much more than any other, right?
Right.
Even the COVID pandemic that we are facing today is has been linked by scientists to the way we are dealing with the planet, right? And that we can expect more such pandemics in the future if we go on the way we are doing. So a change, of course, is necessary, right? And I think that change is what we are offering, and that change, I don't think we need to think is going to be some return to something that existed in the past. Certainly not.
Right. Doctor, I have to tell you that apparently there are a few more people who have asked for questions,
Okay.
which I missed.
Okay.
But we won't open it right now. I'll open it at the end of the interview.
Right.
Also, just well, anyway, almost at the tail end,
Yeah.
I just wanted to talk to you. The last time I spoke to you, you talked about some work your party was doing in relation to caregivers.
Yeah.
Could you just give me a brief on that?
Uh, to the care work. So, in a sense,
Okay.
what we talked about is that when we talk about the economy, we often don't consider or recognize the significance of care work in the economy. And by care work, what we mean is the work that goes into maintaining human life, right? And that is not just the biological thing about giving birth, but it's about all the things that are necessary to sustain human life. That includes sort of, yes, certainly sort of nurturing, raising children, education, healthcare, social security, all of these factors, right? Now, a lot of this work goes in as unpaid work, unpaid care work, which is more or less for cultural reasons, which we can also debate, are usually assigned to women primarily, right? And a lot of this work is unpaid, and it doesn't get recognized as work or as having any kind of economic value. But if you really think about it, no, nothing that we do can actually exist without this incredible amount of work that goes into maintaining human life, maintaining and sustaining, nurturing human life, right? So we have been pushing for the recognition of this as also important, important in terms of the work that gets done in maintaining society, in reproducing society, in sort of ensuring the survival of society, and valuing that work. Now, that doesn't mean that it's like paying people salaries to do work at home or something like that, but it's not just a sort of a financial transaction, but it's a recognition of that work, and ensuring that the kinds of support systems are in place for that work to get done. So that's where it links to where my earlier what I said earlier about the importance of seeing certain things, certain sectors as public goods, right? So that it doesn't become a private responsibility. We see these things as public responsibilities. Nurturing a human life is not a private responsibility. That's a collective responsibility, right? So so the things that go into nurturing life need to be factored for in the sort of public realm, and not just sort of relegated to the private domestic sphere.
Right. Doctor, I just before we finish off, I just have one very important question actually to ask you. I've actually been waiting till the end of this interview to ask you this question. So, there is what we feel may be the beginning of a Me Too movement in Sri Lanka, currently happening on Twitter. Sorry, which I did brief you on beforehand. In summary, a number of female ex-journalists have made public incidents in which they faced sexual and other forms of harassment from male seniors within the journalism industry. And I think what makes most of these journalists bitter is that these men have gone on to have public careers and have been posturing sort of and grandstanding as guardians of moral virtue on social media and elsewhere, which could have been like the tipping point for these revelations.
Yeah.
Now, it goes without saying that this is a complicated matter, and there are legal repercussions. There are lots. I mean, at the moment, it's a very it's just beginning. There's a lot of conversation, things that we call whisper networks going on. But what I want to know is, as someone, and personally, as someone who's been in the media, I do know that from a very young age, these sort of things happened in newsrooms. So it's not without. It's not. How do I put this? It's not a cover up, or it's not a lie. These things exist. So I want to know if there was a movement for taking this off Twitter into the mainstream, would the JVP and the JJB, since you all work so much with vulnerable communities, back a movement like this to empower women journalists, and not just women journalists, but empower people who in newsrooms as a start are people who are abusing their positions of power, or to bring in mechanisms for complaints, to change in HR policy. We've known this like for years, that newsrooms are sort of hotbeds of this sort of abuse of power. Would there be some kind of support from the party?
We would certainly support a move that's making workplaces secure and workplaces safe and secure for women. There's no doubt about that. And I think that's long overdue and something that needs to happen, and that requires a sort of a huge change in how not just in the media world, but I think this problem is endemic in so many areas, right? So certainly, we would approach it as from a point of view of how to make our workplaces safe and secure for all women, right? Not just women,
Right.
for anyone, right? And in that sense, it is really important that victims of sexual harassment or the sexual harassment, gender violence, are allowed to speak, are heard, and have a safe space in which they can do that without being victimized for speaking out, right?
Right.
So I think I can't say right now whether sort of meet. That's something that I don't want to sort of subscribe to and say yes, I'm in support. We are in support of a Me Too movement in Sri Lanka, but we are certainly in support of creating conditions in workplaces where victims of such incidents are heard, are allowed to speak out, and are not silenced, right?
Right.
And that there are those kinds of conditions where people feel compelled to hide these things. I mean, I think that's completely unacceptable, right? They have to be supported to speak out. They have to be heard, and they have to be supported to come out of it, right? And also perpetrators have to be held accountable, right?
Right.
They have to be held accountable where there need to be laws that ensure that they are held accountable. But it's not just about the legal framework; it's also about a certain culture where this kind of thing is seen to be okay, or your sort of or people who speak out on these issues are seen as troublemakers, right? Or sort of kind of disturbing the flow of the workplace place or something, or just
Correct.
making others uncomfortable, right? And I don't think that's acceptable at all, right? So it's
Right.
not just it's so whether I mean I would like to think about it a little bit more to say yes, I'm in support of a Me Too movement, but we are certainly in support of a movement that makes workplaces safe for all, and where victims of such incidents are supported and heard and listened to, and perpetrators are held accountable.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Harini, very much for that answer. I am going to now open it up again for questions, but I have to be very clear. The questions have to be brief. We have already, we're almost at 1.5 hours, and I promised Dr. Harini only an hour's interview. But just brief questions, please. Try to keep it to the point, and Dr. Harini will answer you as briefly as possible. Also, bearing in mind that you can always tweet at her, and if she decides to disable her Twitter account, you can find her on Facebook. You can find her on Facebook afterwards and reach out with your questions. Who do we have? We have
Yes,
Udita,
I'm
I
a
think,
very
already.
reluctant joiner of social media, I have to say.
Correct. I had to ask Dr. Harini to get on Twitter just for this interview and told her she can disable her account afterwards. Udita, would you like to pose your question to Dr. Harini?
Yes, please, Royal. Thank you. Dr. Amarasuriya, thank you so much for taking the question. I'd
Yes.
like to steer the conversation a little bit to Sri Lanka's foreign policy and the
Okay.
JVP's engagement around that.
Yeah.
And so there is this sort of public perception that the JVP tends to engage more when it comes to development and other issues
Mm-hmm.
that concern India, and there might not be the same kind of, or there might be more subdued, sort of engagement when it comes to certain Chinese projects. And we were just wondering what your views on that would be, and what is sort of the JVP's larger approach and understanding and views on Sri Lanka's foreign policy, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again for the question. And once again, I mean, I must remind everyone that I cannot speak. I am not a member of the JVP. I'm only part of an alliance with the JVP. So I can't. I'm not claiming this as JVP policy. I will say that this is in general the policy of the Jatika Janabalabhegya. So for us, it is not the country that is important, but how we engage with a particular country and whether that relationship is advantageous to us or not, right? So it doesn't matter whether it's India, China, USA, or whatever it is. We assess an engagement based on its based from our analysis as how advantageous or not it is to Sri Lanka to Sri Lanka, right? And it is also not it is not with sort of a country. It's not like we have a problem with any particular country. We may disagree with a particular intervention of a government. And I think when for us, uh, international engagement is extremely important, right? Establishing good relations with all countries is extremely important. We need to recognize our position and our negotiating power within sort of regional and global politics and function accordingly, right? We are a small country, but we occupy a critical sort of geographical, we occupy a very critical geographical space where what we do becomes quite significant in terms of regional and global politics, right? We can be the victim of regional and global politics if we don't manage our affairs right. So, as a small country, we think that we shouldn't get ourselves into situations where we become sort of proxies for regional and global politics. We shouldn't be caught between what goes on between sort of say China and India, for instance, or the USA and China. We should try as much as possible to stay out of those kinds of regional and global power sort of struggles. So we should negotiate. We should interact with all countries of as in a way that is advantageous for us and places our national security and the needs of our people at the forefront rather than sort of get trapped into the power games of far more powerful countries.
Thank you, Dr. Harini. There are a few people who have messaged or DM saying that you all have requested. However, we don't have requests in the queue. So can you please request at this point so we can take your questions on? However, we ask you to be as quick as possible. And we're looking to round up the interview by 12:30 at the least. Just let me check with the team to see if there's anything that has come in, Doctor. All right, we don't seem to have any questions. If again, I will remind you all, if you do have a question, hit the mic button on the left, and we will take it on in the little while that we have. All right. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for, I mean, not just this Twitter Spaces, but for your very first Twitter sort of real interaction with the public. And despite the sort of technological, despite the technological issues at the beginning, I'm sure Twitter is not so bad. It's a easy platform to deal with, and lots of interesting cerebral conversations going on. We hope your experience wasn't bad, and I'd like to thank everybody that got on, participated, listened. We hope that the conversation brought out some very important points and factors about how Dr. Harini and the party thinks. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you especially, Dr. Harini.
Thank you, Royal, for this opportunity. Yes, it was my first entry into the Twitter world. My friends will tell you that I am a very uh, what's the word, late developer when it comes to technology, right? So I've been steering clear of many things that require me to be even marginally more technically sophisticated than I am. Yeah, let's say thank you for this time and thank you for the opportunity. And I enjoyed it, and I really hope it was useful for those who joined in.
Agreed. And like we tell everybody, if there are questions that you had that we were not able to take on, or for whatever reason, or you felt were not answered the way you wanted them to be answered, we do encourage you to tweet at or DM Dr. Harini, who I know will take the time to go through them when she's free, as with every other politician that we've had on the show. Thank you so much, everybody, and we'll speak to you all soon.